For those of you who are not here this morning, I'm Garth Myers, and I am the faculty secretary here at the college. And on behalf of our outstanding faculty, I welcome you to this second session of the symposium. This is a particularly exciting one for me. I am officially appointed as the Paul E. Raether Professor of Urban International Studies, with my appointment split between urban studies and international studies, but I'm also the director of the Center for Urban and Global Studies, which we call CUGS. And CUGS, together with the Center for Hartford Engagement and Research and the Center for Caribbean Studies, are the collaborating partners at Trinity in a community-engaged grant from the Mellon Foundation for studying environmental justice in the greater Hartford area in collaboration with the Center for Leadership and Justice and the Stowe Center for Literary Activism. And that's just one kind of example for me in my life and my career of what happens here at Trinity in terms of bridging knowledge and practice. And this is our theme, and I'm very excited to hear from my colleagues on this. I'm going to allow, I'm not going to introduce them, I'm going to allow the moderator of the session to do the introductions, but they are all in very different ways from very different disciplines across different divisions of the college, folks who spend their lives bridging knowledge with practice. And amongst those is our moderator for the session, and I will introduce her now, and that is Professor Jennifer Regan-Lefebvre. She is an historian of modern Britain, Ireland, and British imperialism. She's also the chair of the history department right now. And her most recent publication, Imperial Wine, How the British Empire Made Wine's New World, won the Andre Simon Award. And she's also editing a 6-volume Bloomsbury Cultural History of Wine. She was named to the Future 50 initiative of the global wine industry by Wine and Spirits Education Trust and International Wine and Spirit Competition. She's received both the Trustee Award for Faculty Excellence and the Dean Arthur H. Hughes Award for Teaching Achievement at Trinity. And I'm going to turn things over to you now, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Garth, for that very generous and overly detailed introduction. I'm just the moderator here today. It's these 4 people that you're here to hear about. Thank you all so much for coming on this Friday afternoon. I hope this will be a great conversation. You've all been primed if you've been hearing about awe, so you're ready for something awesome, I hope. Let me introduce my colleagues who are here. They represent a real range of different disciplines and show the breadth of a of a Trinity education. Although I would like to say, history is a fantastic discipline, and I encourage you or any undergraduates you know to consider being a history major. We also have a 6-course minor. No, but seriously, so let me introduce them going down the line. Immediately to my left is Professor Davarian Baldwin of the Department of American Studies. He's the Paul Raether Distinguished Professor of American Studies. You may know him from his work on the Harlem Renaissance or from a really important book about universities and cities. Next, we have Kevin McMahon, the John Reitmeyer Professor of Political Science, who works both in the Department of Political Science and in Public Policy of Law. He's an expert on the U.S. Supreme Court. Professor Michelle Kovarik, the Henry A. DePhillips Jr. Chair of Chemistry, Professor of Chemistry, I should say, Chair of the Department of Chemistry, and an expert in scientific measurement. And then finally, Professor Shafkat Hussain, the George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian Studies, whose expertise in the Department of Anthropology is on snow leopards in northern Pakistan. So if you were wondering at the slideshow, who is that friend who's always sending photos of his cats? That would be Shafkat, and they are beautiful animals. All right, so let's start by talking about, you're all active researchers and dynamic teachers. How is your work boundary spanning, and what does that mean to you? So most academics are trained in a specific discipline and are affiliated with a specific department. But Davarian, you describe yourself as an interdisciplinary scholar. Tell us what that means.
Yeah, so we're going to start really nerdy, okay. So interdisciplinary scholar, meaning, multiple disciplines. And as you pointed out, in most of I'm trained in American studies, and we think, oh, that's the study of America. But it's also an approach to investigation. And so what that means is that in most cases, we come from different disciplines. So say if history, archives, economics, statistical data, what have you, and you start with your methodology, how you're going to engage your data, and then you do the work based on that framework. Well, what we do in American studies is that we start with the subject matter, and we say, okay, what is the subject matter? What are the questions? What various methods do we need to answer this question, to solve this problem? And so we start in that way. And so with that in mind, my particular profile has been a mixture of like kind of archival research, urban policy and planning, and kind of critical theory. And as much as this is about methodology, it's also about kind of transmission of ideas. So in American studies, it's very much, we focus a lot on translation, on transmission in terms of being able to communicate to a broader public. So one of my mentors at New York University, Andrew Ross, came with this idea called cultural reporting. And so that's very much so I've taken on that kind of vein of taking very complex ideas, big concepts, big questions, but trying to translate them in a way that can be more accessible to the public through kind of a journalistic, investigative style of reporting in that area. And so, like as you mentioned, universities and cities, my most recent book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, was a key example of investigative cultural reporting, combining kind of archival materials, 150 contemporary interviews to tell a history of the present about higher education's growing control over the economic development and urban governance of neighborhoods, communities, what I call universe cities. And so in that work, combine maps and, again, interviews and zoning documents and building records, economic data to kind of tell that story in a range of cities across the country. So for me, that's what it means. Another example is taking historical work you mentioned on the Harlem Renaissance and converting that into something like a puzzle. So just recently came out with a puzzle called, can't think of it myself, but it's about the Harlem Renaissance. And so what we did was we took the archival materials, photos, maps, oral histories, and converted that into the form of a jigsaw puzzle. And like I said before, I've been talking about the Harlem Renaissance for 30 years, but that's the thing that people know. Mm-hmm. And that's the capacity that we have at a school like Trinity to be able to convert our ideas in an accessible way with an interdisciplinary approach.
That's fascinating and such an interesting learning tool. I'm currently, some of my students will know, and I know some of you are here, even though I can't see you very well. Thank you for coming. I have a puzzle in my office of French wine regions because I'm always forgetting certain regions, and I'm using that as a sort of mnemonic device and study tool. That's a really creative approach. Shafkat, I want to ask you, in the same vein, you always describe yourself as an applied anthropologist. What does that mean in your field, and how does it have an impact on your practice and your teaching?
So applied anthropologist basically means that you not only teach, but you also try to solve some problems that are out there in the world. So my theoretical interests are in understanding this enduring theme within Western philosophy or Western culture, which is the division between nature and society and nature and culture. And then I see how this thinking is influenced in modern conservation practice. And then I try to look at how when conservation is applied using this thinking on the field, what kind of impacts it has at the local level. And usually there's a clash between how conservationists think about nature and how local people think about nature. And this negative impact then produces some other externalities which needs to be resolved. So basically, that's where the applied nature of my work comes in. To give you an example, I work with snow leopards, and especially snow leopard and farmer conflict in northern Pakistan. There's a tendency within the government departments and also within conservation industry to ignore the problem of snow leopard predation of domestic livestock, because they believe that snow leopard is an iconic wilderness predator and it doesn't sort of attack domestic goats. So in order to sort of find out what's happening, we have to put out cameras out there near villages, look at snow leopard diet. And it turns out that snow leopards are actually, they like to hang out near human villages because they love to eat domestic goats. So what we see is that in nature, those boundaries are hardly ever maintained. So in this case particularly, it's not human society which is encroaching on nature, it's sometimes nature also encroach on human society. But you need to then solve these problems, and the problem that sort of I like to at least solve is how we can produce and promote models based on coexistence, whereas modern conservation principles sort of divide human societies from nature. Because it seems wherever there are snow leopards, there will always be conflict. So you can't kind of get rid of either the wildlife, nature, or society. You have to sort of produce models that both can live together. So we have a compensation scheme, a project that I started about 25 years ago, which gives farmers compensation for the animals they lose. And we also study snow leopard diet, and we find out that a huge proportion of snow leopard diet is domestic livestock, so which also kind of proves our point that these boundaries that are artificially and ideologically created, and when they're implemented, produces some negative consequences that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Obviously, your work takes place geographically quite far from Hartford, but the last time many of us were all together was commencement, where our campus had a visitor from a lovely black bear. So these issues are very much front and center in Connecticut right now. Kevin, can I ask you, as I mentioned, you teach in both public policy and law on the legal side of things and political science. Does any of this boundary spanning discussion resonate with you? I mean, it must be very different teaching at Trinity from teaching at a law school.
Sure. Yeah. I think if you start at, in terms of teaching or in terms of research, if you start with what I think what are interesting questions, right? And how do you answer those interesting questions? If you sort of restrain yourself to your particular field or even your subfield, you may not get the best answer to that question, right? So my work historically has dealt with presidential impacts on the Supreme Court, right? So not much going on these days in that area. So what I'm trying to do is to show the way in which presidents have had an impact or attempted to have an impact, the reasons why they've done that. I'm not just looking at the presidency, I'm looking at party politics, I'm looking at what's going on within the Supreme Court as well. And I also want to write for a broader audience, right? So I really try hard to write in a way that's very accessible, sort of to the intelligent reader. I don't want to go back home to where I grew up and sort of people think like, who the hell does he think he is, right? So I'm trying to speak to a broader audience, and how you do that typically is after you've written your book, as many of you have done as well, is you try to get maybe key concepts out to the general discussion, right? Usually you're doing that with an op-ed or a guest essay, I guess the New York Times calls it now. And maybe that's just one little piece of your book, but it may be picked up by others and become part of the conversation around, in my case, the legitimacy of the Supreme Court.
Great. Michelle, maybe you could jump in here. You're a leader in national conversations around chemistry education at the third level. And you're also co-director of Trinity Center for Teaching and Learning. Do you feel that the liberal arts environment fosters this kind of cross-disciplinary research and teaching?
I do. Probably we wouldn't ask that question if the answer was no. But I think one of the things that's special about a small college like this is how relatively unsiloed we are by discipline. So I've known about Shafqat's research with snow leopards for a long time from being on the faculty research committee, even though my work is very far away from his work in terms of discipline. I also think the boundaries between our teaching and our research are much more porous here than they would be at a more research-focused institution. So I can give an example of the first independent paper that ever came out of my lab that I set up here at Trinity that wasn't associated with my work with my doctoral or postdoctoral advisors came about because I had a student, Allie Tierney, who graduated in 2017, I think. And we were having lab meeting, and she said, hey, my calculus professor was talking about his research today in class, and I think what he's doing could help us answer that question that I got in seminar last semester. And I said, oh, that's cool. Why don't you see if he can come to one of these meetings sometime, and we'll talk to him. And it turned out that, yes, he was the perfect person to help us answer that question, a question that I and my postdoctoral advisor had been getting at conferences for a couple of years. And he, Brooks Emmerich, happened to be a visiting assistant professor in the math department here. And I would probably never have made that connection with him or any other mathematician who did that kind of work if my student hadn't noticed that. And she noticed because he was talking about his research in her calculus class. Closer in time to this, for CTL, we run a new faculty seminar, and I think 2 years ago now, Suzanne Kirikesh was talking about her work looking at Buddhist amulets, and she was having her students catalog this collection that she had come to have that's really special, and mentioned that one of the things that's challenging is sometimes what we think the amulets are made of is not what they're actually made of because of the way they're manufactured, and that there's actually a bit of an economic component to making them and selling them. And my newish colleague, Adam Hill, realized that he knew how to use some non-destructive chemical methods to measure the composition of those amulets. And so they co-supervised a student who did a study of this and found that some of them were not solid metal like they looked, that they were actually composed of other things underneath the surface. And so I think these are great examples of how that porosity between our research and our teaching can be so generative. And in my own work on chemistry education, I think a lot about how we can design our curricula to give students more of that experience, to let them in on our lives as scholars.
That's fantastic. And you also see something then at Trinity that you would never see at a Research One university, which is students frequently publishing with faculty members. That's great. Let's keep talking about our classrooms. Davarian and Michelle, you both have laboratories for students to learn and practice skills. Can you say a few words each about this lab environment and what you achieve through working with students in this way? Maybe, Michelle, you're in a sort of more traditional lab, if we will, because you're in the sciences. Would you like to go first?
Sure. So I think the traditional way of thinking about a teaching laboratory is that it's a place where students go to develop a skill, to practice a skill. But I think what we really want our students to realize is that labs are not just for practicing. Labs are the site of knowledge creation in the sciences. And so in that way, students can contribute to that. And one of the things I think is really great about working with undergraduates here is that, at least in my field, students can begin to contribute even before they've fully mastered the disciplinary subject matter. So there are things that we can physically do to create knowledge, even if we don't have the full theoretical underpinnings all tacked down in our brains. And there was something Kent Dunlap said this morning in the morning symposium about observation as a means of creativity. And I think that that's something that applies here as well. So when my students are in the lab, sometimes they notice things. My student Frances Huff, who's a senior this year, has been working on digesting proteins to study their metal content. And she had noticed, oh, not all of the samples are turning yellow, only some of them are. And we adapted our procedure, and I can tell you that on Wednesday, all of them turned yellow. We think that's a really good sign. She needs to work out the data. I had another student, Asia Hamilton, who's a junior neuroscience major now, and she, right after she graduated high school, participated in a program here for high school students to get research experience before she matriculated to the college. And she was sending these motile cells that we grow, they're freshwater ciliates, through channels into an electric field. And she said, boy, it really looks like they're trying to get away from there. And sure enough, they were. It's a phenomenon called electrotaxis, and she's spent the last 3 years here as a Trinity student designing her own project to investigate how that works in this organism. So I think the thing that's really cool about that is they're able to access those observations without having a full understanding of the theory. And sometimes I don't have a full understanding of the theory. I had a student a few years ago, Jonathan Fan, who was doing some experiments looking at cell adhesion in the microchannels that we use for analysis. And I had told him that I expected more adhesion in this rich cell media, that the cells were going to get stuck more. And that was not what he observed. And we were really stuck on it. And we were trying to put different components of the rich media back into the minimal solution to figure out what was causing this. And I looked up for this event the email I got from him where he wrote to me about 5 years ago today and said, okay, I spent like 6 hours reading papers and I think I found this one. And he had found the one paper where anybody else had observed this, and it helped us explain our results in the paper that he co-authored with me. So I think the thing that's magical about labs is labs make our theory tangible, and they let us test it and see whether the knowledge that we think we have matches with the reality.
How about knowledge and reality in the Smart Cities Lab?
Yeah, our lab is a little bit different. We took our lead from the model of sciences in terms of doing research, but also we're influenced by the notion of like a law clinic in terms of taking the knowledge that where your students are being trained, that work is being used to serve communities. So we add new knowledge with the notion of advocacy, which sometimes can be tricky in academia because we're supposed to be disinterested. But we're very clear that we are very interested and we are of service to community and that we are driven by that. And that gives a different kind of urgency to the training that students have in our research lab. So in our lab, we research and consult on best practices for building equitable urban communities, hence, Smart Cities Lab, with specific focus on higher education-driven development, which comes out of my own book, obviously. But it has implications, and we can talk about it later, all over the world, because this is an ongoing process where universities and nonprofits are driving development. So that is the template for the work that we do, but we think about community building more broadly and definitely with the focus on equity. So students learn the things that we talked about earlier, like interview skills, participant observation work, archival research, spatial analysis, all these, they learn those things like they would in a classroom. And actually my class, Race and Urban Space, is kind of a gateway where I pick some of my best students to then come into the lab to work in the lab. But then they go much more, they go further. This, in the lab, there's a level of urgency that what you're doing is not just for research's sake, but it's to produce and create and enact change. That communities come to us because they know what we've done, they know the wins that we've had, the successes that we've had, and they want us to help them advocate for equitable economic development, for more just laws around policing, for redistricting and political campaigns. So a range of things, and so the research in the lab is driven by that, where it is, I wouldn't say problem-oriented, but issue-oriented. And so it's been really amazing to see students go through the arc of experience from being in the classroom, then learning, kind of what we call applied American studies, taking those concepts and applying them through the work they do with the lab and service to communities, and then go on to have amazing careers. So like one of my star students a couple of years ago who started out in the lab now does work on immigrant resettlement policy in Berlin. Another student is an urban planner in California. One of my students works for the Department of Education in the city of New York. My current student is interested in housing justice and eviction policies in South Africa and the U.S. So we can see the full arc of what students are able to do in this advocacy-oriented lab that's a little bit different, but very much so influenced by the other kind of labs.
Yeah, I think you're both really emphasizing just the satisfaction we have as educators also to see students go through that journey. It feels incredible. Kevin and Shafkat, you can't bring students to your research sites in quite the same way, but you've had powerful experiences of training students. Would you each like to share one?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've always done, I teach courses that dealing with constitutional law, Con Law 1, and the Con Law 2 course is traditionally civil rights and civil liberties. And in those courses, I've always done a moot court. So students act as the justices or they act as attorneys. And that used to be sort of the highlight of the semester. If they're an attorney, they're writing a brief on a case, and the cases are either a case that the court is about to hear, right, a current issue that it hasn't decided on yet, so it's sort of a hot topic, or sometimes I'll write hypothetical cases if I can't find one that I think is particularly interesting around the topics that we're covering. In part because of AI, and I know we may get to that. I'm sort of been rethinking that, and now instead of just having it as a single event toward the end of the semester, I'm actually doing 5 of these moot courts. So where in the past only 1 or 2 students, or 2 students would, maybe 4 students would act as attorneys, which is the more difficult task that they have, and the others would act as justices. Now every student has an opportunity to be an attorney and a justice, and they have to play this role multiple times. And if you ever listen to a Supreme Court oral arguments, it's not an attorney or attorneys standing up there delivering a speech. It's really verbal combat, right, between the justices and the attorneys. It's very active. It's really a discussion. The very interesting questions. Sometimes the attorneys sort of stumble a bit. So that's what I'm trying to do, and why that, and why I mentioned AI. So what I'm thinking there is that in the classroom, and I think we're all trying to figure out best ways to deal with AI, that I want to emphasize skills that you can't go to ChatGPT and get the answer to, right? So skills, thinking on your feet, responding to questions that you might not anticipate, that's something that I think will be emphasized more when students leave Trinity than has been in the past. So that's an example.
So I bring in a lot of sort of raw data from the field into the classroom. So showing, of course, images of snow leopards from camera trap. And then I have also engaged students in actually identifying individual animals because they each have, unique spots. I'm currently working on a research project in which I have involved, I think, 6 or 7 students. So my current research is looking at these comments books that were kept at these family-run hotels in northern Pakistan in this remote mountain town, and during the 1990s, 80s and 90s. And a lot of international backpackers took this route, Karakoram Highway, from Pakistan into China, and they stopped at this little remote town and wrote a lot in these comments books. So these are not just your ordinary comments books where they would sort of say something about the establishment, about the service, the food, da-da-da. I mean, this is a very, very diverse sort of, group of comments ranging from humor to people writing poetry, writing very serious thought, passing cultural advice. There's a lot of vulgarity, abusive language. So it's basically a very rich sort of transcript of these international backpackers and a kind of backstage or offstage into their culture where they basically just talk very freely with each other. There's a lot of dialogue. So it's a lot of data, about 200,000 words of comments written in 25 different languages by about 1,500 different backpackers. So a lot of my students here in Trinity are helping me with transcription, with translation, and then, of course, with coding and doing content analysis. And I think it's been a very rewarding experience for me as well because these backpackers who writing these comments are, I think, the same age as some of the students here at Trinity, in their early 20s. So talking to these, students and especially when we are coding them, so they have to think critically, they have to think, about their own experiences and reflect upon it. And they're just learning, sort of practical skills, how to do qualitative analysis. So yeah, you're right. I would love to take some of my students to the field in northern Pakistan, but it's been difficult. Yeah.
I think one of the most rewarding things I've done in terms of working with students has been the Public Humanities Collaborative, which is a Mellon-funded institution we have at Trinity where students work both with a professor and with a local nonprofit over the summer. So for example, this past summer, I had 2 wonderful students working part-time with me, helping me with editing, and also working with a local history museum where they both flex some incredible skills and also gain some unusual skills. At one point, they were reupholstering an 18th century chair. And I can't say I've ever taught them to do that. But they were also cataloging, developing calendars and archival material for the museum to help it understand its own collections. And they also worked with me in an editorial role. Something that, and Kevin and I have talked about this a lot, that I try to do is I try to write for a wider public, but I also don't always appreciate what terms or expressions are going to be unfamiliar to somebody who's not in my field. So what these students did is they were my general readers for a work that I'm working on. I said, tell me, flag anything that you don't understand, if there's a technical term that I haven't defined for this big editing project I did. And they were wonderful for that. They went far beyond that. They were expert readers by the end. But it's been really exciting to involve students in that work. This brings us to the topic of sort of greater public engagement. I think we've already touched on the Smart Cities Lab and your policy involvement there. Shafqat, you mentioned your NGO as well in terms of conservation. Kevin, you're not expressly trying to shape public policy, as far as I know. But your work is of huge public interest right now. How do you manage that, and how do you get your scholarship to the public with all its nuance?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so this most recent book that I published last 2024, last year, it has this concept of I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but numerical minority justice. So what was I doing there, and how did I come up with this term? So basically what I did was in the research, I counted the votes. So Brett Kavanaugh is a good example. He was confirmed by 2 votes, right, 50 to 48. There was a reason why 2 didn't vote, but I counted the votes in the most recent election of those 50 senators who supported him. And then I counted the votes of the 48 senators in the most recent election who opposed them. And it turned out that the 48 who opposed him collected 24.5 million more votes than the 50 who supported him, right? So this was a concept to me that was sort of quite unusual, and I explored more, and it turned out that there are only 5 justices in the history of the country that are what I define as numerical minority justices, right? And they happen to be all sitting on the Supreme Court, right? Currently, there's only 5 current ever, and they're all on the court now, right? So that idea was sort of picked up by journalists and commentators, and part of the way in trying to get that. So how do you get that one concept out to sort of as I said earlier, the conversation with regard to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court? Has the legitimacy changed? The Supreme Court is sort of odd for democracy, right? A lot of times we have the most respect, as the public has the most respect for the Supreme Court, but most Americans would have great difficulty naming just 1 or 2 justices, right? They deal with these very important issues. Oftentimes the decision is 5-4. They serve for life. Justice Thomas has been on the court since 1991. He's been on the court far longer than most of our students have been alive. So the court is always in question with regard to democratic legitimacy, but has it changed, right? That's sort of what I was asking in this most recent book. Has sort of the dynamic changed? And that's just one, so you take one concept and usually, in my case, through op-eds, try to get it out there, because I know everyone's not going to pick up in a more academic book. And in that case, it did get picked up in numerous outlets. Yeah.
And have you been satisfied with the response? I'm just curious.
Yeah, generally, I think I've been satisfied. Sometimes you see the idea, but you don't see the citation for it. That can be a little frustrating. But yeah, it's generally, certainly satisfying.
Yes, that definitely resonates. Michelle, I'm wondering if you also have a particular STEM-centered perspective on this, because I can see someone saying, well, you can kind of write about the Supreme Court from anywhere, but it must be particularly difficult for your research to have an impact at a small liberal arts college if you are in the sciences. We don't typically see Nobel Prizes going to scientists at liberal arts colleges. We don't typically see Nobel Prizes going to people we know anyway. But tell me about the liberal arts environment and the advantages you see or the disadvantages you see in terms of this type of environment for doing work with a greater impact.
Sure. So if I had gone to a research-intensive school, I would have gotten about 10 times as much startup funding. And instead of having 3 undergrads and a high school student in my lab this semester who each work between 3 and 6 hours a week, I'd have maybe 4 to 20 graduate students and postdoctoral scholars working full-time. So certainly doing laboratory research here at least is not just a matter of scale, but sometimes just fundamentally different kind of work. It's really important, I think, for my colleagues and I to be creative and find a niche where we can be impactful without competing with people who are working on things that might be really avant-garde in our fields. One of the things that came up this morning that I had already been thinking about, but in the creativity session, they talked a lot about constraint as an opportunity, is the way Sarah Bilston put it. She talked about having her students study the sonnet and how you can be inspired to creativity within the constraint of that form. And I was thinking about that so much because when we had met to talk about this panel, I had told Jennifer that I think of the research we do here as being like a haiku compared to the Icelandic saga of what somebody at UC Berkeley who's going to get a Nobel Prize might do. And so certainly you can't do the same thing in a haiku that you can do in a saga, but you can still do something really interesting. And so I'll give you an example. When I got here, I was extremely worried about running out of money because I had historically worked on very expensive things. And I found an old bottle of a chemical that my predecessor, Dave Henderson, had left behind. And I didn't recognize the name of it, but it sounded sort of like something I had used in the past. And I thought, maybe I can use this instead of buying something new. And it actually opened up a whole avenue in my research where about half of the papers I've published here have been looking at oxidative stress in cells, which is not something I had previously looked at. But I had found an old oxidative stress indicator in the lab, and I thought, oh, I could probably use this and save some money. The other thing I think really lets us think about doing impactful work in a liberal arts environment is something that was discussed in at least among scientists, fairly well-known essay from the 90s by Thomas Cech, who got the 1989 Nobel Prize for his studies of the catalytic properties of RNA. And he wrote this paper about science in the liberal arts environment because he and his wife, who was also an extremely accomplished biochemist, both went to Grinnell College. And in this essay, he pulls a lot of data and shows, and I suspect this is still true now, 30 years later, that liberal arts colleges really punch above their weight in the number of graduates who go on to get PhDs in the sciences and the number of those scientists who go on to be National Academies members. And he discusses some of the reasons that he thinks that this might happen. A lot of it has to do with the kind of work that we've all been describing, where students are working on authentic research tasks in very close proximity with an expert, and that sort of apprenticeship model that's at larger institutions more often reserved for graduate students. And the other thing he talks about is this idea of cross-training, that as a chemist, when I take an English class or a philosophy class or a studio arts class, I'm cross-training my brain to think in new modalities and to question the assumptions that might come with my discipline. And I think that's a skill that continues to serve our students. So actually, the most cited thing I've ever published at Trinity is a review article that I wrote with 2 students because they had been doing projects, building instruments as a final capstone project in one of the courses that I teach. And I had been chatting with them and saying like, oh, every year people find different articles for their introduction section, like the research on this idea of building home-built instruments by students is very scattered, and it's all broken apart. And the 2 of them each needed another quarter credit to graduate, to be full-time before they graduated. And they said, can we do an independent study with you about this? And so we went through, and we could have written, I think, a really boring review where we just said, like, and somebody did it like this, and somebody did it with Legos, and somebody did it with a 3D printer, and you can use a light bulb, or you can use an LED. But we really did a lot of work synthesizing things and analyzing things, thinking about when are the scenarios where you'd want to use an LED? When would it be worth teaching your students how to program an Arduino? And that's the most cited thing that as an independent scientist I've ever written, was that work that came out of that project with the students, where I think they were really applying a lot of the skills they got, not just with me, but holistically in their Trinity education.
That's wonderful. Davarian, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly, thinking about this notion of the degree to which you can be nimble, adaptive, and responsive, and work at a different pace at a small liberal arts college. The comparison is usually, well, Research One schools have more money, they can work at greater scale, but the ability to work adaptively and responsively, I think, is a secret sauce of what we can do here. And I think about this particularly in the realm of the engagement, the community engagement space, which is its own field now. And I just gave the keynote at the major conference for the community engagement world last week, and there was a clear fault line there. It was mostly Research One scholars and institutions that were represented there. It was hosted by like Virginia Tech, so big schools, big STEM, big engagement, lots of money, big support, whole divisions. But there was a clear fault line there between those who do engagement work as scholars and those who do engagement work as practitioners. And one of the unspoken kind of things that was going on over and over again was when I was saying, tell them how we could engage and be adaptive and do these work. It's like, well, we can't do that because there is, in our worlds at these schools, this fault line plays out in very real ways in the sense that, yeah, the school says be engaging, do the engagement work, but when it comes to things like promotion, moving up the professional ladder, engagement work is kind of the stepchild of the higher education. Yeah, we love it, we want to put it in the brochures, but you can't get promotion for doing it. And so then I was like, okay, wait a minute, I see this very differently because I'm at a small liberal arts college where I am an expert in engagement work, but I'm also the faculty lead for the Center for Hartford Engagement and Research. So I'm working on both the practitioner side and the research side. And this plays out in very different ways for me because, for example, when we also faced that conundrum here a couple of years ago. But because I'm at Trinity, I could have a conversation with colleagues, have a conversation with the dean, put together a task force. Next thing you know, we have an edit to our faculty manual that allows for those who do engagement work to be seen as having equal value to those that do traditional research. And we can do that here at Trinity in ways that you can't do at a Research One university. So for me, in a very real way, that's a perfect example of the added value that we can do, and particularly in my own area of interest and expertise.
That's really powerful. Before we go over to audience questions, Shafkat, would you like to add anything?
No, I would just second what has already been said, that a lot of our work is just naturally, boundary crossing. We go into other disciplines, especially if we are doing some applied work. So in my own work, when I have to find out, or, are snow leopards really killing domestic livestock? Are snow leopards really coming close to the villages? So those are some of the questions I can't answer because I'm trained as an anthropologist, so I have to go and find, molecular biologists and collaborate with them, and then sort of look at, the whole picture. So I think here at Trinity, you don't feel sort of under pressure to be just a scholar sitting in your ivory tower and producing theories. I think it really gives you this opportunity to actually be more than just a professor or a lecturer and actually do and implement what you think about those theories, right? So I think it is a great opportunity for people who want to be both practitioners and and scholars to be at a liberal art college like Trinity.
And I agree. And, as a wine historian, I get a lot of, winks and nudges when I talk about being a practitioner. But I'm really passionate about changing the way people think about the history of wine to a narrative which is more inclusive and which recognizes the really damaging role that colonialism has had in a lot of wine-producing countries. So going to wine-related events, talking to sommeliers, talking to wine buyers, talking to wine writers is a really fun part of my work. And I think teaching has made me much better at communicating to lots of different groups of people. Some historians say, if you write popular history, you really have to dumb it down. And I thought, well, hang on, I talk to people all the time who don't know what I know. They're my students, and none of them are dumb. Right. They're really smart. And so taking that from teaching and projecting it into my research and using that as how I think about communicating has been really helpful for me, and really fun. And I think in many other institutions, I wouldn't be able to do that kind of experimentation, which has been really fruitful for me. Yeah. Well, I bet you probably have some questions, and we have some mics that are going to rove around so that we can hear you.
He answered everything.
It's awe. They've learned about awe.
We have one right here. We have one right here.
Great.
Yeah, hi. Jim Tozer, class 63. I wonder if some of you, well, not all of you, but a couple of you speak on, is we speak about research institutions. We talk about Trinity College, in which the faculty actually teaches. I appreciate I went to a place where I was never taught by anyone except a knowledgeable professor, which you guys all are. Explain that a little bit, and how that, and you use your students to help you with your research, and then you end up doing jointly signed papers with them. It seems to be enriching on both sides, instead of a large research institution in which some graduate students are hired and made into a fellow, so they have to teach, but it isn't what they came there to do. They came there to do research. So they get assigned the job to teach, and you as a freshman at one of these wonderful institutions get taught by someone who didn't really want to teach. They actually wanted to go do research, but they came to the institution so they could do the work. How does that distinction go, and why is part of that what makes a liberal arts college like Trinity so really special? Or is that just, I'm dreaming it up because I came here?
No, I think, I'll let the others answer as well, but I think very simply put, even though academia is completely a seller's market, there's a lot of qualified people for every one of our jobs, but we are here because we want to research and because we want to teach. We find pleasure and satisfaction in both of those things, and I wouldn't want to be in a job where I only did one of those things. I don't know what the rest of you think.
Yeah, I can tell a quick story, I guess. When I first finished my dissertation, got a job in academia, I went to a panel at our major conference, American Political Science Association conference, and it was the title was something like, how to transition into the profession, right? And that you're sort of almost a workshop, lessons from more advanced scholars of how to fit in and to get things right, how to get tenure. And one of the persons basically said, don't worry about your teaching, right? Get through the teaching, give your lectures, but basically for the next 6 years, the tenure clock is about 6 years in most places, you should be working on your publications, right? That should be your sole focus. Definitely you certainly have to teach, but you shouldn't try to, excel at teaching, right? And I think certainly at a place like Trinity, that just isn't going to work, right? That we really highlight this idea of being both a teacher and a scholar, and we, as you suggested, graduate students aren't teaching the students, the professors are teaching the students, and as Jennifer just suggested, I would totally agree with that the teaching and the necessity to try to explain difficult concepts to our students, I think aids greatly when you're writing, particularly when you're trying to appeal to a wider audience.
As a former graduate student who really wanted to teach, I will say sometimes I think graduate students are excellent teachers, really dedicated and learning their craft. But I think the thing that's nice about a school like Trinity, and when I talk to high school students about where they might want to apply to college, I think this is something for them to think about, is students can have amazing experiences at big institutions. They can get research jobs at big institutions and work with graduate students and postdocs and sometimes publish there too. But they have to be really proactive, and they have to maybe be a little lucky because there aren't as many opportunities and things are a little more uneven. And I think that at a place like this, it's so much more accessible for students to have that really positive experience, that they're going to be proactively reached out to by the faculty and by the staff here who are really paying attention to our students and really thinking about what's best for them. When you're trying to keep millions of dollars worth of grants, especially right now, your first thought can't always be about what's best for your students' learning. But here, I can always be thinking about what is the best thing for this student's learning? What does this student need to be working on to develop from where they are right now? And that's actually one of the reasons I wanted to come to a place like this. This was my Goldilocks school. I only applied to a small number of places because I knew I was going to be separated from my significant other for a year when I got my job. And I only applied to undergraduate schools that had research programs for undergraduates. And still, there's a huge breadth of what that means, the amount of support and the expectations for what faculty will produce. And Trinity, to me, was just the right, not too hot, not too cold, not too much teaching, not too much research, just right. And one of the things I appreciate so much is when I was working at a research institution and I flubbed an experiment or something didn't work, I felt like I had wasted the day. And I never feel like I've wasted a day in the lab with my students here, because even if we screwed it up, they learned why you can't run a kinase assay without magnesium in the buffer. And that is a worthy thing to have happen.
We have another question.
I'm curious, I hear, as I'm sure you do too, in a larger cultural sense, there's a tension over the purpose of college, over whether we're aiming for a broader education of making, as I sometimes say, the inside of our students' heads a place they want to spend the rest of their lives versus something in a vein of job training. And I'm curious, that's a tension that we, discuss a lot in the classroom, but I'm curious whether you experience that tension in the context of research as well. And if you could comment a little bit on how research fits into sort of that spectrum, or how it explores that vector space.
Who'd like to take this one? I mean, why not both, Professor Hill? Trinity alum.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the research question and the career development question, for me, I think about it in the sense that there's nothing wrong with training students for the future. But we also know that with this generation of students, they're going to have maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 or 6 different careers. So having such a very strict professional training track is not going to even suit them well for the market that we imagine there to be. So for me and for us, it actually takes us back to the origins of liberal arts colleges in terms of training you for life, the whole person. But take into account like new technologies, new orientations, new understandings of the world. But it is about developing a global citizen, a life person, whatever phrase you want to use, or applied knowledge. But it goes back to the question or the issue again of being adaptive, and the understanding of humility and faith in the sense that you don't know what jobs are going to be there in the next 10 years. But are we training a certain orientation of mind and spirit, a certain kind of orientation? And this is no diss on my science people, but we get beat up a lot in the humanities and social sciences for students. And and I think this applies to liberal arts more broadly. We say, well, yeah, we can't teach you necessarily how to solve the problems, but over here, we teach you how to ask the right questions. And I think that applies to liberal arts more broadly.
I was going to say maybe just your question, Adam, made me think about a survey that I did about 4 years ago where we asked a bunch of faculty who teach analytical chemistry, which is my subdiscipline of chemistry, a bunch of questions about what they teach and how they teach. And one of the questions we asked was, do you do anything in your analytical chemistry courses to relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And this was optional. People didn't have to answer. Some people did answer, some people said really interesting things, but I'll never forget reading when we were coding responses, one person wrote, "A titration is a titration." And I thought, what a stupid thing to think, because I'm not teaching a titration, I'm teaching a person. And to what Davarian was saying is we don't know what those people are going to do. And we're not just teaching them content knowledge, we're teaching them how to use that content knowledge. That's the whole point, I think, of this panel, is that we're bridging knowledge and practice means that students are going to take the things we teach them out into the world and do something with them. And we want them to be thinking about what is the right thing to be doing with that knowledge.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I came directly from teaching before this. And we had a wonderful discussion about professional ethics in the field of history. It's from my senior thesis seminar. A really wonderful group, and I feel very privileged to teach that class. And what was really interesting to me is how deeply my student understood the process of doing research as one that is sometimes slow, sometimes a bit tedious. You have to be quite meticulous. You have to have method, you have to be organized, and that they felt these values very deeply. And that was very satisfying, because I don't expect many of them to go on to become history professors. In fact, I'd recommend not to. No, I'm kidding, I love my job. and it's wonderful, but the opportunities are very limited. Most of them probably won't work in historical fields, but learning the discipline of history and how to go about answering a question, how to find the right question to ask, and then what are the steps you need to take to begin to answer that question? What do you have to take into account? I mean, that's what makes us educated people. We know how to find information, and then we know what to do with it. So that's the most amazing thing we can give to our students, and exposing them to our own research, sharing our research with them, and sometimes even involving them in our research. That's how we do it. That's how we build that skill.
There's another question here.
Hi, I'm Sheila Holmes, and I'm from Virginia, and I'm a practicing attorney that specializes in poverty law. I have a question about the professor of political science, Professor Kevin. I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Yeah. So what is your thought about the current Supreme Court and the decisions that are coming down for our kids in this Gen Z? Because I also have a millennial, and I can tell you the decisions that have come down, I would have never thought would have affected her, how they have affected her. So any thought about that?
Yeah, a few thoughts. I don't know. I don't know how much time we have. So,
We have 8 minutes.
yeah, I mean, I guess what's the best way to answer that in a short amount of time? Yeah, I mean, I think this court will be a very impactful court. Right? There's a clear six conservatives, and it seems like a court that's certainly quite willing, in the case of Roe versus Wade, to upend longstanding precedent. It's a court that I think, is, aside from President Trump, is quite willing to expand the power of the presidency. That's been a long-standing sort of goal of conservatives in legal thought. So, I think this court will, because it has this majority, because it has what has been a long-standing, developing plan once power was attained to undo what we're seeing as bad decisions, problematic decisions like Roe versus Wade. It has the opportunity, it has the ability to really transform constitutional law for the next generation, and that's I think we've seen that already, and I think we'll see more of that.
Another one?
Good afternoon. I would like to know from any of you how artificial intelligence and its current capabilities have changed or improved how it is that you teach your students, and what you might be excited about as it changes constantly. Thank you.
Yeah, like I said earlier, I think a lot of us are still trying to figure this out, right? How can we use AI as a tool in the classroom? At the beginning of the semester, I have a conversation with my students about using AI and try to get a sense of how they use it and whether or not, it crosses the line. In terms of the example I gave with the moot court, it's forced me to focus on skills that they can't get from AI, right? So less focus on writing, more focus, at least writing outside the classroom, more focus on writing inside the classroom, more focus on speaking on their feet, right? Those types of ideas. I have a new project that I'm working on that deals with the 19th century, a famous case from the 19th century. And in that case, this is just personally, this isn't in the classroom, it's been an amazing tool because I basically read the trial transcript of this case, and I asked AI to create an image of what happened. It was a murder case, what happened in this murder case. And really, to my astoundment, it gave me this amazing image, this very powerful image that wasn't, as you might expect, this case was from 1855. There were no images, right? There were no photography, there were no some weak drawings, right? So there's an example where AI was really an amazing tool to sort of bring to life this event that occurred 180 years ago. So ways of trying to think through that, I think, will take time and will require some, obviously trial and error in the classroom.
I'll just say real quickly that I've been antiseptic at best when it comes to new technology. Try to avoid it, but AI has come into my life and my engagement work, advocacy, in ways I didn't expect in the last 2 weeks, whereby a group of rogue developers and coders came to me and like, we see what you're doing with your lab, and while you're doing great social justice work on the content and advocacy side, you have no knowledge about what's happening on the technology side, and you need help. And we want to help you. And we put together this new system called Good Graph, because when you put your materials into ChatGPT, they own it and they will sell it back to you eventually. And so the IP piece and your social justice orientations need to extend to the technology side. And so now we're working with them, and they're creating our own independent AI system so that we can maintain control over our data in a way that allows us to use technology without being subjected to it in unjust ways, so that our technological side matches our mission side. So that's something that I never thought was going to happen, but things you can't avoid. But it also is a powerful learning tool for my students to talk about things like plagiarism, what is aid as compared to copying or learning. All these things that I didn't want to deal with, it's been a powerful and impactful instigator to have these conversations at a broad level in ways I never expected.
If we have a minute, I'll just say, I could talk about this for a long time. Jennifer mentioned that I am one of the co-directors of our Center for Teaching and Learning, which does professional development for our faculty around their teaching. And so we have been thinking about AI in our classrooms a lot the last couple of years. And I think it's great that you asked about this in an optimistic way, like what are we excited about? Because I will say for a lot of teachers, there's so much anxiety about AI because it upends a lot of the status quo. And as I said, I could say a lot, but I think one thing that I want to say that I think is relevant to this panel is, I think one good thing about it is it's making us reevaluate how we assess student learning. And I think something I've been thinking about a lot is how do we give students tasks that close the feedback loop, where if they didn't genuinely learn something, if it really was just an AI output and they weren't contributing to it, that signal comes back around and tells them, hey, you didn't learn this. And what that looks like the kind of authentic tasks that we've been describing doing with our students, things that there are stakes to getting it wrong, there are stakes to not thoroughly understanding it, there are stakes to not recognizing when the AI was wrong about something. And so I think in the ways that it's pushing us to think about assigning our students more meaningful work, that's gonna be a really positive outcome. It's a little scary right now as we figure out what that's going to look like. But I think that there are a lot of advantages once we figure that out. And something that maybe we have a big advantage because it's hard to scale those assignments. So it's going to be hard to do that in a 200-person lecture at a big school, but here we can really work with our students on that kind of work.
Yeah, along the same lines, I think I'm also one of those professors who is sort of very shy of this kind of technology, so I haven't even used it. Once I used it for writing recommendation letters, so it can save you a lot of times if you are doing that kind of work. But apart from that, I had to sort of modify some of my teaching and course assessment strategies. So again, rather than giving students assignments that they have to complete outside the classroom, so a lot of assignments are now in class, short quizzes, or their presentations. So that's one way of sort of just ensuring that they are not using the AI the ways in which I don't want them to use. But at the same time, it also can be helpful as a research tool. And I just also learned recently that you can actually use AI to identify camera trap images and videos much more quickly than you would do visually. So yeah.
I think as a historian, I'm less optimistic than some of you. In a field that's so tied to ideas about authority, I suppose, even as we question it, and also writing and the construction of narrative, it really does feel like an existential crisis. So I think, but one thing I have done, which I think is good, is I speak a lot more about authorship with my students. And I've always tried to make my students feel that the work they do for me matters, that it's not just I'm asking them to jump through a hoop by writing an essay. And I joke that, what you do is you put this in a box and it goes in your parents' basement, and then when you're 40, they tell you they're downsizing and you have to get rid of all this stuff. True story. But that actually, when you're writing an essay, you're entering into dialogue with other scholars, even if you'll never meet them. But I've met some of them, And I bring in guest speakers sometimes, and I have students read their work because I want them to understand that you're talking to real people, even if it's only on the page and it never gets to them. That's what academia is. It's a larger conversation. So, I recently found out that my work has been used, 8 pieces I've written in a massive language model, and I am entitled to some compensation in a class action suit, so that's exciting. So, to me, it's not been a positive thing as an author, but if that's something I've realized that I truly value as a historian, then that's something I want to teach. So in that sense, if there's a positive to AI in my field, it's making us concentrate on what's really important to us and what we value as scholars. So maybe that's a good note to end on. I hope this panel has shown how we all bridge disciplines, how the specific environment at Trinity fosters that, and how that's a good thing, I hope, for both our students and for the wider public in which we live. So thank you all so much for coming today.